All right, so get ready because today we're taking a deep dive into the mind of Immanuel Kant.
Yeah.
I know when you hear that name, you probably think, oh, critique of pure reason or the categorical imperative, like all those, philosophical heavy hitters. But today, we're going to kind of go off the beaten path a little bit. We're going to explore a side of Kant that might surprise even, a seasoned philosopher like yourself.
Yeah, that's right. Today we're going to uncover Kant the scientist because, his philosophical development was actually really intertwined with his understanding of like the natural world and particularly things like physics and cosmology. He wasn't like just an armchair philosopher. He was really grappling with the like fundamental nature of reality itself and doing so through a kind of scientific lens.
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah.
Okay. And our guide for this journey is going to be the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on Kant's philosophical development.
Sure.
It's honestly a treasure trove of information, and it
Mhm.
reveals this like fascinating and unexpected story about Kant's intellectual journey.
Yeah, and it really challenges like the traditional view of Kant as, just like a late blooming philosopher, focused only on metaphysics and ethics. Recent research has actually suggested that he was engaging with like cutting edge scientific questions from a very young age.
That's awesome. Okay, so picture this, right? It's the 18th century, and young Emmanuel is growing up in Königsberg. He's
Mhm.
spending his days exploring nature with his mother, walking through meadows, learning about plants and animals, gazing at the night sky. Like these really idyllic walks, they actually instilled in him this deep fascination with like natural philosophy.
Yeah, it's like those early experiences really planted the seeds for his later scientific inquiries. But this idyllic picture, it contrasts really sharply with like the rigid pietist education that he received at the Collegium Fridericianum. It was a very restrictive environment, very focused on religious dogma and rote learning, which likely really shaped his later views on freedom and autonomy, those ideas he'd grapple with throughout his entire philosophical career.
Right. And get this, he excelled in Latin and Greek.
Yeah.
Classic philosopher material, right? But he really struggled with math, which was, of course, crucial for understanding the scientific advancements of his time.
Yeah, and this lack of formal training in mathematics, it's actually key to understanding his approach to science. He wasn't like a number cruncher, he was more of a conceptual innovator. So instead of like getting bogged down in equations, he focused on the big picture, like really trying to grasp the fundamental principles that were governing the natural world.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And that brings us to one of his early works, Thoughts on the True Estimation of Living Forces, where he dives headfirst into one of the hottest scientific debates of the era, the Viva controversy.
Right. Now, this controversy was all about the nature of force. Think Descartes versus Leibniz, titans of philosophy and science, clashing over the very essence of motion and energy. Descartes argued that force is simply a quantity of motion, reducible to the product of mass and velocity, what we now call momentum. Leibniz, on the other hand, championed the concept of like living force, arguing that force is something more fundamental, a dynamic essence that can't just be reduced to mere motion. He associated it with what we now understand as kinetic energy, proportional to mass times velocity squared.
Oh, okay. So Kant steps into this intellectual arena, and he's not shying away from the challenge at all. He's actually trying to synthesize these seemingly opposing views, arguing that both momentum and kinetic energy are actually legitimate quantities that contribute to a full understanding of force.
Yeah, it's a brilliant move. Like instead of siding with one camp or the other, he tries to find a middle ground, the
Yeah.
way to bridge the gap between these seemingly conflicting viewpoints. And what's really remarkable is that in doing so, he actually foreshadows later scientific discoveries about the relationship between momentum and energy. And remember, this is way before the concept of energy conservation was fully understood.
Right. It's like he's intuiting something really profound about the nature of force, even though the scientific language of his time couldn't fully express it.
Exactly. And this intuition goes beyond just simply reconciling Cartesian and Leibnizian mechanics. Kant sees force as more than just like a mathematical concept. He sees it as the essence of action, a fundamental principle that actually shapes the very structure of the universe.
So this leads us to his concept of the force-space bond, which is crucial to understanding his later work. It's this idea that force and space are intimately intertwined, that force actually shapes space, and space in turn kind of governs the action of force.
Yeah, and that's like a radical departure from the Newtonian view of space as like a passive container. For Kant, space is an active participant in the unfolding of nature, like shaped and molded by the forces that operate within it. He envisions a dynamic interaction where, like, force expands into the void, creating this field that then gives rise to a scattering of
So
particles.
instead of like a static clockwork universe, we have a universe that's constantly in flux, driven by the interplay of these forces.
Exactly, precisely. And this dynamic worldview is fully expressed in his Universal Natural History and Theory of the Sky, where he presents her groundbreaking and, let's be honest, somewhat audacious nebular hypothesis.
Yeah, here's where things get really exciting, even for someone who has studied Kant for years. He's not just playing with philosophical ideas, he's proposing this like bold new explanation for the formation of planets, stars, even galaxies.
Right, and he's doing it at a time when most people believe that the universe was static and unchanging. The prevailing view was that, the solar system as we know it was created by God in, like, a single act of creation. But Kant challenges this view, arguing that the universe formed gradually through a natural process of, like, self-organization.
Wow. So he's basically saying that the order and complexity that we see in the cosmos kind of arose spontaneously from this chaotic cloud of particles.
Right, and he explains this process in detail, building on his earlier ideas about force and space. He envisions a primordial nebula, this like vast cloud of gas and dust where particles are constantly colliding and interacting under the influence of these like attractive and repulsive forces. And over time, these forces lead to the formation of like denser regions which eventually collapse under their own gravity to form, stars and planets.
And this is all happening without any divine intervention. So
Yeah.
he's essentially proposing like a secular cosmology.
Exactly, yeah. And this is where he diverges significantly from Newton, who believed that God's active hand was necessary to maintain the like stability of the solar system.
But Kant goes even further, right?
hmm
He argues that there's this inherent essential striving within nature itself, a drive towards greater complexity and order.
Yeah, it's this idea of an essential striving, like suggesting that teleology, the idea of purpose or goal directedness, is actually embedded within nature itself, not imposed from the outside by a like divine creator.
So fascinating.
Yeah.
And this brings us to like one of his most intriguing and perhaps underappreciated
Yeah.
concepts, the chain of nature.
Yeah.
He argues that everything in the universe is interconnected, forming this like vast and intricate web of relationships.
Yeah, and he challenges like the anthropocentrism that was so prevalent at the time, suggesting that humans are just one link in this vast chain, not necessarily the most important or superior link. He even speculates about the possibility of extraterrestrial life, suggesting that we might not be alone in the universe.
It's almost like he's anticipating like modern ecological thinking, recognizing the interconnectedness of all living things and that like delicate balance of ecosystems.
Exactly. He saw the universe as like a unified whole, a dynamic system where everything is interconnected and interdependent. It's a vision that resonates deeply with like contemporary scientific understandings of the universe, even if some of his, specific scientific ideas have since been, superseded.
So we've got this picture of Kant as this scientific thinker grappling with force and space and the formation of the universe. But what always strikes me about him is he doesn't just stay in one lane. Like he's constantly pushing the boundaries, questioning his own assumptions, and kind of venturing into new intellectual territory.
Yeah, that's one of the things that makes him such a compelling figure. He's not afraid to wrestle with these like really difficult questions, even if it means questioning the very foundations of his own thinking.
Right. And this intellectual restlessness is really evident in his later pre-critical works where he starts to grapple, I think, more explicitly with the limits of human knowledge and the, like, very possibility of metaphysics.
And remember, this is, the era of the Enlightenment, a time of just immense intellectual ferment and debate about like the nature of reason and knowledge and belief. And Kant is right in the thick of it, engaging with some of the most challenging questions of his day.
Totally. And you can see this shift in focus, I think, work like the new elucidation of the first principles of metaphysical cognition. Here, he's wrestling with a problem that continues to, like, plague philosophers even today, the relationship between human freedom and natural necessity.
Yeah, it's the classic dilemma.
Mhm.
If the universe operates according to deterministic laws, like how can human actions be truly free? How can we reconcile the idea of, free will with the idea of a lawful, predictable universe?
Right, it's enough to make your head spin. So how does Kant attempt to, like, square this circle?
Well, he does it by drawing this really subtle but crucial distinction between I think, different levels of reality.
Mhm.
He argues that while the natural world, like the realm of physical objects and events, is governed by these deterministic laws, there's another realm, the realm of human freedom, that operates according to different principles.
So he's not denying the reality of, like, deterministic laws. He's just saying they don't tell the whole story.
Exactly, yeah. He's trying to find a way for human freedom to exist within like a lawful natural order. And he argues that free will is what he calls a determining power, this like capacity to resist external impulses and to act according to, self-imposed laws of reason.
So it's like he's carving out a space for human agency within a universe that might otherwise seem completely determined.
Exactly. And this distinction between like these different levels of reality, it becomes even more pronounced in his later work. You start to see him developing this key distinction between, the phenomenal realm, the world as we experience it through our senses, and the noumenal realm, the realm of things in themselves, which lies beyond our direct
Oh,
experience.
I see. That's a distinction that'll, of course, become like absolutely central to his critical philosophy. But even in these pre-critical works, you can really see him wrestling with these, like, profound questions about the limits of human knowledge and the nature of reality.
Right. And this struggle, I think, intensifies in his work on the existence of God, the only possible ground of a demonstration of God's existence. Here, he engages with both, ontological and teleological arguments for God's existence, arguments that had been central to Western philosophy for centuries.
Right. I remember studying these arguments in my, like, undergrad philosophy classes. The ontological argument tries to prove God's existence from the very concept of God. And then the teleological argument kind of points to the order and purpose we see in the natural world as evidence for, like, a divine designer.
Exactly. But Kant, while acknowledging, I think, the intellectual appeal of these arguments,
Yeah.
ultimately finds them, wanting. He begins to express some pretty serious doubts about the ability of, like, pure reason to prove God's existence or to really provide us with, like, this metaphysical certainty.
So he's not necessarily saying God doesn't exist. He's just saying that we can't definitively prove God's existence through, like, rational argument alone.
Right. He's starting to question the limits of reason, the limits of, what we can know about the ultimate nature of reality.
Hmm.
And this skepticism is further fueled, I think, by his encounter with the writings of the Swedish mystic Emanuel Swedenborg.
Oh, yeah. Swedenborg was a fascinating and controversial figure. He claimed to have these experiences like visions of heaven and hell and communicating with angels and spirits. What did Kant think about all this?
Well, initially, I think Kant was kind of intrigued by these claims, but ultimately he became deeply critical of, Swedenborg's mysticism.
Okay, so it's almost like Swedenborg represents like this kind of intellectual temptation for Kant, this temptation to reach for knowledge that's beyond the limits of reason and experience.
Right. And while Kant might have been initially drawn to the like allure of Swedenborg's mystical insights, he ultimately rejects them as like fantasies, wild figments of the imagination.
And he doesn't hold back his criticism at all. In his satirical work, Dreams of a Spirit Seer, he mercilessly lampoons, like, Swedenborg's mystical claims.
Yeah, but it's not just Swedenborg who's the target of like Kant's critique. There's a sense in which he's also critiquing himself, his own earlier tendency to engage in like speculative metaphysics. It's a moment of like profound self-reflection where Kant confronts the limitations of his own thinking and the dangers of like unbridled speculation.
It was like he's realizing that the human mind can sometimes be its own worst enemy, kind of leading us astray with wishful thinking and unfounded beliefs.
Yeah, and this self-critique, this willingness to question his own assumptions is what ultimately sets the stage for, his critical period. It's the foundation upon which he'll build his, revolutionary critique of pure reason.
It's a fascinating journey, isn't it? From exploring, the formation of the cosmos to questioning the very foundations of knowledge itself. Kant's pre-critical period is really a testament to his like intellectual breadth and his unwavering commitment to seeking, truth wherever it may lead. But I'm particularly curious to hear your thoughts on this transition, from his early scientific work to his increasingly skeptical stance toward like traditional metaphysics. What do you think was driving this shift?
Well, I think there are a few key factors at play here. First, as we've discussed, Kant was just deeply immersed in, the scientific debates of his era. He was grappling with like the latest discoveries in physics and astronomy, and this exposure to the scientific method likely instilled in him this like greater appreciation for the importance of empirical evidence and rigorous reasoning.
So he's seeing the power of science to explain the natural world, and he's starting to wonder if traditional metaphysics can really stand up to that kind of scrutiny.
Exactly. And I think this scientific influence is also intertwined with a second factor, his growing awareness of the limitations of human reason. As he delves deeper into these philosophical questions, he starts to realize that there are certain things that we simply cannot know with, like certainty.
Right, he's bumping up against the limits of, what we can know about the ultimate nature of reality, about things like God or the soul or the nature of freedom.
Exactly. And this realization leads him to question the very project of, traditional metaphysics, which was often based on this assumption that, reason alone could unlock the secrets of the universe.
Okay, so instead of trying to build these like grand metaphysical systems that purport to explain everything, he's starting to focus on this more modest, but perhaps more profound question. Like, what are the limits of human knowledge?
Precisely. And this shift in focus, I think, really marks the transition to his critical period, a period where he'll undertake this like radical reassessment of the nature and limit of human reason.
And that, of course, is where his most famous work, The Critique of Pure Reason, comes in. It's the culmination of his pre-critical journey, a work that will, you know, revolutionize philosophy and continue to shape our understanding of knowledge and reason and the human mind to this very day. All right, so we've journeyed through Kant's early fascinations with science, his forays into cosmology, and we've witnessed his growing skepticism toward traditional metaphysics. And now we arrive at the culmination of all of this, the Critique of Pure Reason. It's a monumental work. It's often seen as dense and daunting, but I think understanding its core ideas is crucial for grasping the full impact of Kant's thought.
Absolutely. Yeah. The critique is really a turning point, not just in Kant's own intellectual development, but in the history of Western philosophy as a whole. It's a work that fundamentally, reshapes the philosophical landscape. It forces us to rethink the very nature and limits of human reason.
I am ready to have my mind reshaped. So where do we even begin? What's the central question that Kant is grappling with in the critique?
Well, at its heart, the critique is an attempt to answer this deceptively simple question. What can we know? You know, Kant is trying to determine the conditions of possibility for human knowledge, to figure out what it is about our minds that allows us to have knowledge of the world in the first place.
So he's not just interested in what we know, but how we know it, right? It's
Yeah.
about understanding the structure of human understanding itself.
Exactly, yeah. Kant argues that our minds aren't passive receptacles that simply receive information from the outside world. Rather, our minds are active participants in the construction of knowledge. So we don't just perceive the world as it is, we actually shape and structure our experience through the categories of our understanding.
Okay, now you're getting into some of the more technical aspects of Kant's philosophy. I remember struggling with these concepts when I first, encountered the critique. Could you break down some of these key ideas for us, maybe in a way that even someone who isn't, a Kant scholar can understand?
Sure. Let's start with one of Kant's most important distinctions, the difference between analytic and synthetic judgments. So an analytic judgment is a statement that is true by definition. For example, the statement all bachelors are unmarried men is analytic because the concept of bachelor already contains the concept of unmarried man. In other words, the predicate is already contained within the subject.
So it's a kind of tautology, right?
Yeah.
You're not really adding any new information to the concept of bachelor by saying that they're unmarried.
Exactly. But synthetic judgments, on the other hand, they actually add new information to the subject. So for example, the statement, this table is brown, is synthetic because the concept of table doesn't necessarily include the concept of brown, right? We have to look at the table to determine its color.
Oh, okay. So analytic judgments are true by definition, while synthetic judgments are based on experience. But why is this distinction so important for Kant?
Well, because Kant is trying to figure out how we can have synthetic a priori knowledge, knowledge that is both informative and necessarily true independent of experience. He believes that mathematics and some of the fundamental principles of natural science, they kind of fall into this category.
Okay, so for example, the statement 7 plus 5 equals 12 isn't just true by definition. It's a statement that tells us something new about the world. And yet it seems
Mhm.
to be like necessarily true, regardless of our experience.
Exactly, yeah. And this raises this like really profound question for Kant. How is such knowledge possible? How can we have, knowledge of the world that goes beyond mere definitions, but is nevertheless independent of like experience?
So he's trying to explain how we can have knowledge that's both like grounded in our minds and yet tells us something real about the world.
Precisely. And this leads him to like one of his most radical and influential ideas. The idea that, the structure of our experience is shaped by the categories of our understanding. And these categories are like, built-in lenses through which we like perceive and understand the world.
Okay, so these categories aren't something that we learn from experience. They're like innate, part of the very structure of our minds.
Right, exactly. And Kant identifies, a number of these categories, including space and time and causality and substance. He argues that these categories are like necessary conditions for any possible experience.
So we can't even have an experience of the world without these categories, like shaping and structuring our perceptions.
Exactly. And this means that the world as we experience it, the phenomenal world, as Kant calls it, is not the world in itself, the noumenal world. The phenomenal world is the world as it appears to us, kind of filtered through the categories of our understanding.
So there's like a gap, a fundamental distinction between the world as it is in itself and the world as we experience it. And this distinction, as I recall, has like pretty profound implications for Kant's views on metaphysics.
Absolutely. Kant argues that, like, traditional metaphysics, which attempted to make claims about the nature of reality beyond our experience, about things like God or the soul or the ultimate nature of the universe, was making claims that, like, couldn't be justified. It was trying to access the noumenal realm, which is, by definition, beyond the reach of, like, human reason.
So all those grand metaphysical systems that attempted to like explain everything, Kant's saying they were overstepping their bounds. They were trying to know what is ultimately unknowable.
Exactly. And he's not saying that these things, don't exist. He's just saying that we can't have knowledge of them because they lie like beyond the limits of human experience and understanding.
This is where things get really like mind-bending for me. If we can only know the phenomenal world, the world as it appears to us, does that mean that like reality is just a projection of our own minds?
Well, that's a common misunderstanding of Kant. He's not saying that reality is like subjective or that we create the world through our thoughts. Rather, he's saying that the world as we experience it is a product of the interaction between our minds and the, things in themselves.
So there's like a real world out there, a noumenal realm, but we can only access it through the, filter of our own cognitive faculties.
Precisely. And this has like important implications for our understanding of science. Kant sees science as a, valid form of knowledge, but he argues that it too must operate, within the bounds of human understanding. Scientific knowledge is based on experience, on observations of the phenomenal world. It can't, like, make claims about the ultimate nature of reality, the things in
So
themselves.
science can tell us about the like laws of nature, about how things work in the world we experience, but it can't answer those like ultimate metaphysical questions.
Right. It can't tell us, like, why the universe exists or, what the nature of ultimate reality is.
So where does that leave philosophy if like traditional metaphysics is out and science is limited to the phenomenal world? What role is left for philosophical inquiry?
Well, Kant sees a vital role for philosophy, but it's a role that's been transformed by, his critical turn. Philosophy for Kant becomes this critical enterprise, like an examination of the conditions of possibility for knowledge and morality and aesthetic judgment.
Oh, okay. So instead of trying to build these grand systems that explain everything, philosophy becomes a kind of like self-reflection, a critical inquiry into the nature and limits of our own faculties.
Exactly. And this, like, self-reflection has profound implications for how we understand ourselves and our place in the world and, the nature of freedom and morality. It's a project that continues to resonate with, philosophers today, even those who might disagree with, like, specific aspects of Kant's system.
It's amazing to think about the like enduring impact of the critique. It's been over 2 centuries since it was published, and we're still grappling with, its ideas, still debating their meaning and significance.
And that's a testament to the like power and depth of Kant's thought. He wasn't just trying to answer the philosophical questions of like his day, he was asking questions that continue to challenge us, that force us to confront the fundamental mysteries of, knowledge and existence and the human condition.
I think that's a perfect place to end our deep dive today. We've covered a lot of ground, from Kant's early scientific explorations to his revolutionary critique of pure reason.
Huh.
And while we've only scratched the surface of his vast and intricate philosophical system, I hope this, exploration has given you a new appreciation for, like, the breadth and depth of his thought.
Yeah, I agree. And for our listener, I think the key takeaway is that, Kant's journey is a reminder that knowledge is not this like static thing, but this dynamic process of questioning and exploring and pushing the boundaries of what we think we know. He challenges us to be critical thinkers, to examine our assumptions, and to, never stop seeking a deeper understanding.
And who knows? Maybe this deep dive will inspire you to embark on, like, your own Kantian exploration. There's a whole universe of thought waiting to be discovered within his work. So until next time, keep diving.